I want to tell you something about the way certain men say the words, "It's not personal." They say it the way someone says, "no offense" before saying something deeply offensive, or the way a person says, "with all due respect" before demonstrating that they have none. They use it as a kind of verbal anesthetic, something they administer to themselves so they don't have to feel the cut of what they're about to do to you. Marcus Hale said it to me on a Tuesday morning in March, and he said it while looking slightly to the left of my face, at some point on the wall behind me, as if eye contact would have made it too real. "It's not personal, Renata. We're just going in a different direction with the IT infrastructure." I remember thinking, as the words landed, that I had heard more convincing lies from people who were actively bad at lying. But I smiled, because that is what I do, and I said I understood, and I shook his hand, and I walked out of the building on Meridian Street in Indianapolis with my cardboard box and my dignity intact, and I did not cry until I was sitting in my car in the parking garage on the second level where the fluorescent light above Space 42 had been flickering for 3 months, and no one had fixed it. I should give you the full picture because context matters and because the story doesn't make sense without it. My name is Renata Osebonsu, and at the time Marcus Hale said those words to me, I had been his company's head of IT infrastructure for 2 years and 4 months. The company was called LumenArc, a tech-forward event management startup that had raised $12 million in a Series A round and was, by most measures, doing reasonably well. Marcus had founded it with 2 college friends, a man named Derek Chin who handled business development, and a woman named Priya Subramaniam who was the COO and who was, in my opinion, the only reason the company functioned at all. Marcus was the CEO, which meant he was the vision person, the pitch person, the person who went to conferences and said things like disrupting the hospitality vertical without apparent irony. He was charming in the way that certain people are charming, effortlessly, unreflectively, with the confidence of someone who has never had to work very hard to get people to like him. He was also, underneath the charm, profoundly careless about the people who were not directly useful to him in any given moment. I had built LumenArc's entire IT infrastructure from the ground up. When I arrived, they had 12 employees sharing a patchwork of cloud services that didn't talk to each other properly, a cybersecurity posture that could generously be described as aspirational, and a server situation that made me physically wince the first time I looked at it. Over the following 2 years, I had standardized everything, implemented a proper security framework, negotiated vendor contracts that saved the company approximately $230,000 annually, and hired and trained a team of 4 IT specialists who were, by the time I was let go, running the smoothest technical operation the company had ever had. I had also, and this matters, negotiated the lease for LumenArc's office space. That last part requires a small detour, because it's the part that becomes important later. LumenArc's offices were on the 4th floor of a building called the Corwin Center, a converted warehouse in the Fountain Square neighborhood that had been developed into mixed commercial space about 7 years prior. The building was owned by a company called Hartwell Properties, which was in turn managed on a day-to-day basis by a property manager named Gloria Osebonsu. My aunt, my father's younger sister, who had worked in commercial real estate for 22 years and who managed 3 buildings in the Indianapolis metro area and who had, when I was looking for office space for a growing startup 2 years prior, shown me the 4th floor of the Corwin Center and said, "This is the right space for them, Renata. I know it's a little more than they wanted to spend, but the bones are right." I had negotiated hard on that lease on LumenArc's behalf and gotten them favorable terms, and I had signed as an authorized representative of the company, and everything had been above board and disclosed and professional. But the relationship meant that Aunt Gloria knew me, trusted me, and had my number in her phone. Marcus' stated reason for letting me go was, as you have already gathered, IT issues. The specifics, as communicated in the termination meeting and in the paperwork I received afterward, amounted to a vague claim that the company was restructuring its technical infrastructure approach and moving toward a more integrated vendor model that would reduce the need for a large internal IT team. This was, to be direct about it, invented. I knew it was invented because 3 weeks before my termination, I had sat in a meeting with Marcus and Derek and Priya and 2 representatives from a consulting firm called Nexus Digital, and I had listened to Nexus Digital propose exactly this integrated vendor model. And I had then spent 4 days preparing a comprehensive counter-analysis demonstrating that the Nexus approach would cost the company significantly more money, create substantial security vulnerabilities, and introduce Service dependencies that would put Luminark at operational risk during their upcoming expansion phase. My analysis was thorough, and it was correct, and Priya had said so out loud in the follow-up meeting. Marcus had nodded along and said we'd take it under advisement. What I did not know at the time, and what I pieced together afterward, was that Marcus had a personal relationship with the founder of Nexus Digital, a man named Todd Garfield, who had been 2 years ahead of him at Purdue and who played in the same golf league. The contract that Luminark was about to sign with Nexus Digital was worth approximately $400,000 in the first year. I don't know if there was a formal arrangement between Marcus and Todd, and I want to be careful not to assert things I cannot prove. What I do know is that my analysis threatened that contract, and that within 10 days of my presenting it, I no longer... The weeks after losing a job are a particular kind of strange, I think, especially for people who have been defined by their work in the way that I had been defined by mine. I am the daughter of 2 Ghanaian immigrants who raised me to believe that competence was the one currency that could not be devalued, that if you were excellent at what you did, then the world would have to reckon with you. I had built my career on that belief. I had a master's degree in information systems from Purdue, 7 years of professional experience, multiple industry certifications, and a track record that any company in my field would have been happy to have on their team. I knew intellectually that I would be fine. But there is a difference between knowing something intellectually and feeling it in your chest at 2 in the morning, and for the first week or so the feeling in my chest was something cold and tight that I did not want examined too closely. I filed for unemployment benefits. I updated my resume. I called my professional contacts and let them know I was available. I went for long runs along the canal because movement helped me think, and because I had a feeling in those early days that I needed to think very clearly about what had happened and what, if anything, I was going to do about it. Because here's the thing about what Marcus had done. It wasn't just that he'd fired me. It was the way he'd done it. The pretextual reason, the careful avoidance of anything that might constitute a paper trail, the way the termination letter was precisely vague enough to make a legal challenge difficult. He had done it the way someone does something when they have thought about how to do it and decided that the best approach is one that leaves the other person with no clear handhold. It was, I thought, the act of someone who had learned how to be expedient without being accountable, and who assumed that the people he was expedient with would simply absorb the consequence and move on. I was moving on. I was doing exactly that. But I was also, on one of my canal runs about 9 days after the termination, thinking about the Corwin Center lease. The lease that I had negotiated, on Luminark's behalf, had a term of 3 years. There were currently about 22 months remaining on that term. The lease contained, as most commercial leases do, a number of standard clauses governing the rights and responsibilities of both parties. I knew this because I had negotiated it, and because I had, at the time, read every word of it carefully. One of those clauses was a standard assignment and subletting provision, which governed what happened if the tenant company underwent a change of control or restructuring. Another was a guarantee provision, which specified the conditions under which the lease guarantee remained in force. And there was a clause, which I had actually pushed to include because I had thought it was good practice, that tied certain lease protections to the continued employment of the authorized signatory in an executive or senior management capacity. I want to be precise about this, because I am not the kind of person who exaggerates for effect. The clause did not, on its own, give Hartwell Properties the right to terminate the lease simply because I was no longer employed by Luminark. That would have been too clean, too simple, and commercial lease law in Indiana is not that accommodating. What the clause did do is create a notification obligation. Luminark was required to notify Hartwell Properties within 30 days of any material change in the senior management structure that affected the authorized signatory of a lease. Failure to provide that notification was a default under the lease terms, which triggered a cure period, after which Hartwell Properties had certain remedies available to it, including, under specific circumstances, termination of the lease. Luminark had not notified Hartwell Properties that I had been terminated. I know they hadn't because I asked Aunt Gloria, in a phone call 9 days after my termination, whether she had received any communication from Luminark recently. I kept the question casual. I said I had just been doing some thinking about the Corwin Center situation and wanted to make sure everything was in order. Aunt Gloria said no. She hadn't heard anything from them, which was normal because they were good tenants and she only usually heard from them about maintenance requests. I asked her, also casually, if she still had a copy of the lease and its amendments somewhere accessible. She said yes, of course, she had everything on file. I asked if she remembered the signatory notification clause, the one I had asked to include. There was a brief pause, and then Aunt Gloria said, in the particular tone she uses when she is putting something together, "Renata, what happened?" I told her. I told her the whole thing, the Nexus Digital situation, the analysis I had prepared, the timeline of events, the termination, and the pretext. I told her I wasn't calling to ask her to do anything, that I just wanted to make sure she was aware of the situation in case it was relevant to how she managed the Hartwell Properties relationship with Luminark going forward. Aunt Gloria listened without interrupting, which is something she is very good at, and when I was done she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "So, they haven't sent us a notification letter." It was not really a question. "No," I said. "I don't believe they have." Another pause. "Well," said Aunt Gloria, "that would be a default under Section 14C of the lease." "Yes," I said. "I believe it would." I want to be clear that what happened next was Aunt Gloria's decision, made in accordance with her professional responsibilities as property manager for Hartwell Properties. I did not ask her to do anything specific. I did not draft any letters or instruct her on how to proceed. What I did was make sure she had accurate information, and then I let her do her job. Aunt Gloria is a professional with 22 years of experience and a responsibility to her employer to manage their leases in accordance with their terms. On day 31 after my termination, one day after the notification deadline in the lease had expired, Hartwell Properties sent Luminark a formal notice of default under Section 14C of their commercial lease agreement. The letter was precise, professional, and unambiguous. It cited the specific provision, identified the specific default, and triggered the 30-day cure period during which Luminark could remedy the situation. It was accompanied by a request for Luminark to confirm the current status of their authorized lease signatory and to provide updated signatory documentation. I know some of this from Aunt Gloria, who kept me informed as a professional courtesy, and I know some of it from Priya, who called me on the day the default notice arrived. Priya Subramaniam and I had, during my 2 years at Luminark, developed something close to genuine friendship. She was sharp and fair-minded, and she had told me, privately, 2 days after my termination, that she thought what Marcus had done was wrong, and that she had said so to his face. She was still at Luminark because she had equity and because she believed in what the company was building separate from what Marcus sometimes was, but she was not Marcus' person, and she made that clear. When she called me on the day the default notice arrived, her voice had a quality in it that I had never heard before, something between bewilderment and a kind of exhausted admiration.
"Renata," she said.
"Did you have something to do with this?" "I let someone know about a relevant professional development," I said. There was a pause, and then Priya laughed, a short, startled sound. "The notification clause," she said. "I remember when you put that in. I thought it was just good practice." "It is good practice," I said. The cure period was 30 days. During those 30 days, Marcus Hale discovered that resolving a commercial lease default is not a simple matter, particularly when the default involves a signatory provision that was tied to a specific named individual who no longer worked for the company. And when the property manager on the other end of the negotiation is a 22-year veteran of commercial real estate who is not inclined to make things easy for a tenant who has been, in her professional assessment, careless about their contractual obligations. Hartwell Properties' position, consistently maintained throughout the cure period, was that the notification failure was a material default and that remedying it required more than simply submitting new signatory documentation. It required demonstrating to the property manager's satisfaction that Luminark's management had the organizational stability and contractual awareness necessary to remain a reliable tenant under the remaining lease term. What this meant, in practice, was that Marcus Hale spent approximately 6 weeks in lease renegotiation discussions with my Aunt Gloria. I did not observe these discussions directly, but I heard about them, and based on what I heard, they were not pleasant experiences for Marcus. Aunt Gloria is extremely polite, extremely prepared, and completely immovable when she believes she is in the right. She had reviewed the original lease, the amendments, the default notice, and 3 years of tenant correspondence, and she came to every meeting with documentation that Marcus' team was not always prepared to match. At one point, I was told, Marcus suggested that the whole matter was a technicality and asked if they could just move past it. Aunt Gloria had apparently responded that commercial lease defaults were not technicalities, but were in fact legally meaningful events, and that Hartwell Properties' fiduciary responsibility to its principal required her to address them as such. The cure period expired without a mutually satisfactory resolution. Hartwell Properties issued a notice of termination of the lease. Here I want to pause and be honest with you about something because I think honesty matters and because I am not a person who pretends my motivations are simpler or purer than they are. I was not entirely neutral in this. I was glad. I sat in my apartment on the evening that Priya called me to tell me the termination notice had arrived, and I felt something that I will not dress up as anything other than satisfaction, a clear, warm, uncomplicated satisfaction that a person who had treated me as disposable was now discovering that the things you do to people have a tendency to have consequences you didn't plan for. I had not engineered this. I had not manipulated anyone or done anything professionally improper. But I had made sure that accurate information reached the person who needed to have it, and I had done so knowing what that information might set in motion, and I am not going to stand here and pretend that I didn't. Luminark had 60 days to vacate the Corwin Center premises. The thing about having your startup's lease terminated is that it creates a cascade of problems that are individually manageable but collectively exhausting and expensive. You need to find new space, which in a competitive commercial real estate market means a broker and a timeline and likely a gap period. You need to move your operations, which for a company like Luminark meant coordinating the physical relocation of IT equipment, server infrastructure, client-facing systems, and 43 employees' worth of workstations. You need to handle the legal and financial dimensions of the terminated lease, including the question of what, if any, liability Luminark carried as a result of the default. And you need to do all of this while continuing to run a company that had, at exactly this moment, just signed a $400,000 contract with a vendor whose services had not yet been fully implemented and whose integrated infrastructure model was, as I had predicted in my analysis, creating operational complications. I know about the operational complications because Derek Chin called me. This was about 3 weeks after the termination notice, and it was the call that surprised me most because Derek and I had never been particularly close, and because calling your former head of IT to ask for advice about your current IT situation requires a certain degree of self-awareness that I would not have predicted from Derek. But he called, and he was direct about it. Nexus Digital's implementation was behind schedule. The migration had created 3 separate instances of data sync issues, they had experienced 2 client-facing outages in the previous 10 days, and the internal IT team, which had been reduced to 2 people in the restructuring, was overwhelmed. He wanted to know if I would consider coming back as a consultant. Not as a full-time employee, he clarified this quickly, perhaps anticipating my response, but as an outside consultant to help stabilize the... I asked Derek if Marcus knew he was calling me. There was a pause that answered the question before he did. "I'm reaching out independently," he said. "Marcus is focused on the relocation right now." I thought about this for a moment. I thought about what it meant that Derek was calling me independently, and what it said about the internal dynamics at Luminark that the co-founder was making this call, without the CEO's knowledge. "Derek," I said, "I appreciate you calling. I want to be honest with you. I am not in a position to help Luminark on a consulting basis right now. I have accepted a new position, and I am in the final stages of negotiating my contract." This was true. I had, in fact, been offered a director of IT infrastructure role at a healthcare technology firm called Meridian Health Systems, and the compensation was notably better than what I had been earning at Luminark, but I want to say this to you directly. The analysis I presented before I was let go is accurate. I stand behind everything in that document. If anyone at Luminark wants to use it as a framework for stabilizing the current situation, I have no objection to that. Derek was quiet for a moment and then said, "I thought that might be the case." "I think you did," I said. "I hope things stabilize." I mean that. And I did mean it, mostly because I knew that the 43 people who worked at Luminark had nothing to do with what Marcus had done to me, and I didn't want them to be the ones who absorbed the consequence of his decisions. I started at Meridian Health Systems on a Monday in early June, 11 weeks after Marcus Hale had told me it wasn't personal. My title was Director of IT Infrastructure, and my team was 14 people, and the first thing I did, in my first week, was conduct a comprehensive audit of the existing systems, because that is how I approach every new situation. The work was good, and the people were good, and I found, to my relief, that the cold, tight feeling in my chest from those first weeks after the termination had gone, replaced by something warmer and more forward-facing. I heard about what happened to Luminarch over the following months, mostly through Priya, who sent me occasional updates with the tone of someone recounting a natural disaster she had been present for, but had not caused. The relocation, which was supposed to take 6 weeks, took 11, partly because the new space they found required significant build-out and partly because coordinating a move while managing an IT infrastructure crisis is exactly as difficult as it sounds. The Nexus digital implementation continued to have problems, and 2 clients who experienced service disruptions during the transition period exercised termination clauses in their contracts and left. One of those clients was a mid-sized corporate event company that had represented approximately 8% of Luminarch's annual revenue. The resulting financial strain led to a renegotiation of the Series A terms with their lead investor, and in that renegotiation, Marcus' equity stake was diluted, and a new independent board member was appointed with explicit oversight responsibilities for executive decision-making. The new board member, I learned from Priya with some amusement, was a woman named Claudette Morris who had 30 years of experience in technology company governance and who, in her first board meeting, reportedly asked to see the documentation supporting the decision to terminate the head of IT infrastructure and engage Nexus Digital as a replacement. Marcus had answered this question and the follow-up questions and the request for the analysis that had been prepared prior to the termination decision, and by the end of that board meeting the situation had been examined in more detail than it had ever been examined before. I do not know precisely what was said in that meeting or in the ones that followed. I know that Todd Garfield's consulting firm did not renew with Luminarch at the end of the initial contract term. I know that Marcus Hale stepped back from day-to-day operational responsibilities and into a strategic advisory role in the fall of that year. And I know that Priya Subramaniam was named CEO of Luminarch in October, 7 months after I had walked out of the building with my cardboard box. Priya called me when the announcement was made public, and we talked for almost an hour. She was measured about it, the way she is measured about most things, not crowing or dramatizing but speaking with a kind of careful clarity about what had happened and what she thought it meant. She said that the board's confidence in her was something she took seriously and intended to justify through results. She said that the operational lessons of the previous 7 months had been expensive but clarifying. And then she said something that I have thought about since, something she said with a particular directness that I appreciated. I want you to know that I think what happened to you is wrong, and I think the fact that it had consequences was appropriate. I don't think the people who do what Marcus did should always just get to move on. I told her I appreciated her saying so. I want to ask you something, she said. Would you ever consider coming back? I laughed, a real laugh, the kind that surprises you. Priya, I said, I am very happy where I am. I know, she said. I had to ask. I know you did, I said. I'm glad you're running it. I mean that. I do mean it. I mean it because Priya is the kind of person who should be running things, and because the company that the 43 employees show up to work at every day deserves to be led by someone who thinks carefully about the people around her. Whatever I feel about what happened to me, the company itself was not the problem. The company was a collection of people doing work they cared about, and it deserved better stewardship than it had been getting. There is a version of this story where the lesson is about revenge, where the point is the satisfying geometry of a wrong receiving its consequence. I understand why that reading is appealing. There is something deeply human about wanting the ledger to balance, wanting the person who treated you carelessly to feel the weight of that carelessness. I felt that. I will not pretend I didn't. But when I sit with the whole thing now, from the distance of almost a year, I think the more accurate lesson is something different. It is about information and documentation, and the way that careful record-keeping creates a kind of power that the people who rely on carelessness never anticipate. I had built Luminarch's infrastructure. I had negotiated their lease. I had prepared an analysis that was thorough and correct. I had documented everything, as I always document everything, because I believe that the difference between an accusation and a fact is often simply a paper trail. When Marcus decided that I was disposable, he was operating on the assumption that I would absorb the consequence and disappear, the way people who have always been able to walk away from their messes assume the mess will simply resolve itself. What he forgot, or perhaps never understood, is that the people who build things know exactly what they built, and where the load-bearing elements are, and what happens when someone careless walks through and knocks the wrong thing over. I went for a run along the canal this morning, the same canal I ran along in those first cold weeks after the termination. The light on the water was different from how it looks in March, warmer, more forgiving, the particular gold of an Indiana summer morning. I ran past the point where I had first started thinking clearly about the lease clause, past the bench where I had sat to catch my breath and stare at the water, and let the pieces of what I knew arrange themselves into something useful. I am not a person who believes in signs or symmetry, particularly. But I noticed the light, and I noticed that I was running faster than I had been running in March, and I noticed that the cold, tight feeling in my chest was entirely gone, replaced by something that I can only describe as the particular ease of a person who knows exactly who she is and what she is capable of, and who has no remaining uncertainty about whether the world will have to reckon with her.
It will.
It already did. And I was there to see it.